Hello, my name is Hernan Sorgentini. I'm a professor at the School of Humanities and Educational Sciences at the National University of La Plata, and I'd like to welcome you all again to the third cycle of conferences that we are holding as part of this new joint project between the USA and Argentina, Shared Dialogues on Gender, Ethnicity, Geopolitics, History, and Memory. The project is one of the beneficiaries of the U.S. Embassy in Argentina's grant program for cooperation and exchange projects. The University of La Plata is extremely grateful to the Embassy for choosing and sponsoring this series of conferences. At these events, 22 professors from the USA and Argentina discuss and call into question the connections, intersections, and points of contact between concepts such as ethnicity, class, feminism, testimonial literature, translation, and the decolonial term. The talks are also a wonderful opportunity to discuss issues on language teaching, geopolitics, history, and memory. This afternoon, we'll have the 9th session of this series of virtual conferences called Colonial Inheritances, Popular Memories, and Intersectionality in the Social Mobilizations of Our Time. I would like to thank Ana Principi, the Undersecretary of Interinstitutional Relations of our school, who is the coordinator of the whole project, and to the director of our master program in History and Memory, Ana Barleta, and the director of the Human Rights Department, Lucia Batista, and the director of the Gender and Feminist Policies Department, Sol Calandria, for the organization of these conferences in particular. I'm now pleased to hand over to my colleague Sol Calandria, who will introduce our speaker today, Professor Michelle McKinley.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Gracias, Hernán, por la presentación, Lucía, por la invitación, y por supuesto muchas gracias Michelle McKinley, nuestra invitada profesora de honor. Para nosotras, en nuestra Facultad de Humanidades y Ciencias de la Educación, es realmente un honor tenerte acá con nosotros, con nosotras, escucharte. Sos realmente, Michelle, una profesora de lujo, y el lujo realmente es nuestro de poder compartir esta instancia tan grata y tan importante para nosotros y nosotras con vos. Michelle es profesora de Derecho de la Universidad de Oregon. Ella fue directora del Centro de Estudios para la Mujer en la Sociedad durante el 2016 y 2021. Además, dictó clases en múltiples universidades, es una profesora muy convocada internacionalmente. Dio clases como profesora invitada en la Universidad de los Andes en Bogotá, en Princeton University, en Kansas University, y en la Universidad de Hawái también, entre otras. Michelle es autora además de múltiples artículos académicos publicados en revistas con referato, y entre esas publicaciones me gustaría destacar principalmente su libro, que es un libro que ha tenido mucho impacto en pensar en la historiografía y en la historia del derecho con perspectiva de género, que es una intersección que es muy importante y a su vez muy novedosa. Michelle ha sido pionera en el cruce de estos temas de estudio, y publicó su libro llamado Libertad Fraccionadas, Esclavitud, Intimidad y Movilización Jurídica en Lima Colonial, 1600 y 1700, que fue publicado en inglés, y también es interesante compartir con nuestro público que su libro también fue publicado en castellano por la editorial Tirant-Leblanc de Madrid. Así que bueno, Michelle, muchas gracias por estar acá con nosotros y con nosotras, y te escuchamos muy atentamente.
Muchísimas gracias a todas, y sobre todo a ti, Sol, para esta invitación. Yo creo que es parte de una conversación muy larga que hemos tenido antes, que nos interrumpió el COVID, que se supone que yo iba a venir allá y compartir con todos ustedes, pero estoy muy agradecida, y también les pido mil disculpas a todo el público por las dificultades de la de la transmisión, pero ahí vamos. Y muchísimas gracias de antemano para su atención. Mira, lo que podríamos hacer es, dadas las dificultades, Lucía va a compartir la pantalla, y lo que podríamos hacer es ir como rápidamente por los slides y luego, ¿no? Es un poco ahí para Lucía. Porque siempre mi idea es llevar al público al sitio, ¿no? Al sitio de Perú. Ustedes ya están en Buenos Aires, yo aquí en Sevilla, pero siempre, ¿no? Mi corazón está en Sudamérica, ¿no? En Lima. Entonces, pero mucha gente cuando ellos empiezan pensando en el Perú, eso es lo que piensan, ¿no? Machu Picchu, los Andes, la cordillera, y ahora avanza, sí, o sea, las caras de los Andes. La gente no piensa, avanza, la gente realmente avanza. Ahí para, no retroceder. Cuando se piensa, pues en Lima, muchas veces se piensa en, ¿no? Un rico ceviche o lo que sea, pero el tema de esclavitud y el tema de negritud se ha quedado un poco en la historia, ¿no? Entonces, a mí me gustaría volver al siglo XVII, cuando la ciudad de Lima era una ciudad casi almost a predominantly Black city, right? So, no, ahí está, no, ya pasamos con el ceviche y ya pasamos ahí está, el siguiente.
I'm sorry, I wanted to say the mostly, but mayoritariamente, pero
sí,
me quedé por eso.
Ahí, yeah. So, next slide. Yeah. So, by the 17th century, the city of Lima was predominantly Black and Iberian, mostly. And the city, next slide. The city has its own, violent past. In 1535, after the Spanish defeat of the Inca nobility over decades, a protracted defeat, the Spaniards established themselves in what was spectacularly called the Ciudad de los Reyes, the City of Kings. Next slide, please. So architecturally, the Baroque city was impressive. I'm sure lots of you have visited the city and you can, you can see for yourselves. But the Iberians concentrated, next slide please, on importing what they knew, right? So this is Plaza de Armas, what they knew in the peninsula. They focused primarily on two institutions, the church and the court. So the colonial legal system was organized according to a series of audiencias or high courts, of which the Audiencia of Lima and the Audiencia of New Spain were very prestigious and very important. Of course, there's quite a bit of back and forth competition between which audiencia was more prestigious, but suffice it to say that an appointment in either audiencia was, a real step up in the colonial bureaucracy, right? So why the focus on law and courts, and why the focus on the church would be a good question. They could have brought other things, but they brought this with them. And so, the answer is that Iberians brought with them what they knew, and Iberians were incredibly litigious, right? In one of the more cited comparisons, to put Iberian litigiousness in perspective, Richard Kagan, the legal historian, points to the difference in litigation rates between the Cancillería of Valladolid and the Chancery Court of England in the 16th century. So both of them have, both these regions have similar jurisdictions, similar populations, and the same sort of power to hear, although I think the Cancillerías had more jurisdictions over different subject matters. But the Chancery Court in England heard 500 cases a year. And the Cancillería, at the same pace, heard between 5,000 and 6,000 cases a year, right? And this is just the Cancillería. This is not like everything else, right? So there's a lot of litigation that is happening concurrently and also within the court. So the point is that everybody sued everybody, right? You know, they sued over everything. They sued over their honor. They sued over their broken hearts. They sued over, you know, what should have happened that didn't happen. Courts were open for business. And so courts were open for business to what we call legal dependents, right? Widows, enslaved people, indigenous people, women, apprentices, everybody took their grievances with their superiors to court. And the Crown appointed special legal counsel, procuradores de pobres, to hear their cases and represent them without, often without charge. Okay, next slide, Lucia, please. So what does this mean for the law of slavery, right? The field of comparative slavery until recently has relied on a very sharp distinction between Iberian slave laws and British Atlantic laws. Iberians had centuries of experience with slavery on the peninsula and consistently had an extensive body of law that had been developed to regulate slavery, right? Drawing on Roman law, there was a large body of a large corpus dictating how a person could be enslaved and how that person could be freed. Most scholars agree that the Roman law of slavery was much more concerned with the conditions of manumission because the circumstances under which a person could be enslaved were actually quite limited, right? It's just you could either be a fruit of the spear, so you have it was a question of war, but there are myriad ways in which a person could be freed, right? In contrast, when the British became involved in the in the slave trade, they were starting out at a historical moment without having a body of laws to deal with slavery in England, and much more so at a moment when the colonial economy would become dependent on slave labor, access to slaves, and a commitment to keeping people enslaved. So, of course, scholars have studied the conundrum that slavery raised for the American Republic, right? A country founded with a commitment to democracy and an equally vigorous embrace of slavery. Lucia, can I get the next slide? So this, sort of just shows you, takes you through the partidas, and this is, a fragment of the clauses and the títulos and the leyes in which people can become free, right? According to this code. Can you get me to the next slide, Lucia? Okay, and then this is, the sort of the British Atlantic tradition. All right, next slide. So, Frank Tannenbaum turns up a lot in these conversations, and I don't want to dwell on him that much, but we sort of have to do it because he was one of the earliest scholars to really say that there was within the civil law, and in addition to the power of the Catholic Church, there was the Roman law of slavery actually gave slaves legal and moral personality, and that civil law created many more paths to manumission. Now, what what scholars have disputed Tannenbaum for, not that this is incorrect, it's just that he thought that the law was much more powerful. And it's really what it is that people are the ones who are mobilizing the law to act, in their behalf. So this, but this is to just sort of, scaffold the argument. And so with regard to the law, I do think that the binary between the Iberian and British slave laws is like most binaries. It's only valuable as a heuristic. It's only valuable as a way in which we can see things clearly and then take them apart. Slavery is an institution that is heavily dependent on its existence on the law. It can't exist without law. And, people in the United States, my colleagues in the United States are also sort of refocusing their attention away from these iconic Supreme Court decisions like State v. Mann or Dred Scott, and they're looking more at people's courts, debt, probate, all of those kinds of courts where law comes up from below, and that we see that they're very there's quite a bit of convergence. But anyway, we're all sort of benefiting from the trend of studying slavery without slaves, right? Like we have to study people. So can I go to the next slide, Lucia? Okay, this is a little bit of an odd slide because it's supposed to be interactive, so I don't know how it's gonna work. Maybe the next one, like if you keep on doing the arrow. Yeah, there's like something's supposed to happen here, and then one other arrow again. Okay, so no, can we go back? Okay, so so this is this kind of sticky comparison, right, between the British Atlantic and the Iberian world that I've tried to address in my work that avoids the Tannenbaum thesis, but it has to confront parts of it. And what I study is this, what's called fractional freedoms, as Sol mentioned, the title of my book, which is really not that, people didn't live in the early modern world or in the colonial world. People didn't live in absolute freedom and they didn't live in absolute bondage, right? They lived in the middle. And what I have said is that this is a place of contingent liberty. This is a place of fractional freedom, right? Where people accrue over time this, it's almost like making deposits into your freedom account, right? And over time and over the life cycle and over, this is an extremely gendered experience. It's a geographic experience, right? If you're on a plantation, as opposed to being in a city, all of this makes sense. But, what I want to focus on is where people are living in this, not necessarily liminal space, right? It's a space of legality and it's a space of movement and of possibility. And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about today. But before we move on, there are people who look at this slide and they'll say, okay, fractional freedom is like a half empty glass, right? Fractional freedom is a way of keeping people under control. It's a mode of control. It keeps people compliant, right? This promise of manumission, this promise of eventual freedom. It keeps them from rebelling. It keeps them from running away because of this promise. For me, because I'm a half glass is half full person, I see it as a condition to which people aspired and that they accommodated their lives around. Right? This was their possibility. This is where they were going to be able to live. Aspirational and real. And this was the legal sphere in which mostly women, and that's the sort of the subjects of what I'm going to talk about today. So can we see the next slide, Lucia? Thank you. I promise this one is not a dancing slide. Anyway. So let's just think a little bit about the conventional subjects of Latin American history, right? Colonial Latin American history. The men who conquered, they write constitutions, they rebel. you know, they are these sort of tortured, you know, el encarcelazo. And can we see the next slide, please? So my subjects are slaves within the domestic slave-holding household. And I approach the household, can you see the next slide? And then the next one. And then the next one. Yeah, so I you know, this is a very famous painting by Lasso, and it's called The Three Races, Las Tres Razas. But what I really like about it is that it really shows that the domestic household is this, you know, sort of dense and raucous place, right? It's this dense political site that people don't generally approach as a site of politics, right? Because it's private. But it is a place of, you know, dirty linen, literally, and, you know, snotty noses and, you know, breast milk and chamber pots and all of the, you know, this is the reality of a household. And it is also a place of tension and joy and envy and desire and confrontation. And so what I do, sadness, aggression, grief. So what I do is I'm not just looking at this in this sort of upstairs, downstairs, you know, very British kind of idea of where servants live and where masters live, but as a very fluid space of politics and where relationships of race, class, gender, generation, status, and condition are all work out. And I really want to unpack these conflations of law, these sort of easy conflations of law as justice, law in its magisterial claims to justice, relationships like master-slave. Can you go back to the, yeah, like, what is this relationship, right? If you were to kind of unpack this, these are, you know, from the Estudio Curret. This is actually later than my period, but like, what is happening here, right? How is this really something that we can call a master-slave relationship? And then the first slide, I mean, the one that comes before this. Well, this was supposed to line up with my dirty linen, but that's fine. The other one. The one before this. Yeah, so like, what's going on here, right? Is this master slave? You know, what is this I see here? I see intimacy. I see, I see something that's much more complicated than just a very flat idea of master slave, right? Anyway, so I want to think about this also, the idea of history as this triumphal march towards modernity. I really want to think about all of these things together. So actually, to do that, I have to take you to the archive. So, and then Lucia, there's not that much that happens after these slides. So if we go maybe 4 over, yeah, so that's just the cover of my book. And then, yeah, so this is the archive, and then the next one. Okay, and this is this poor man that I have, you know, driven crazy over the years. But these are the conditions of the, you know, the work that we, the stories that we uncover. And then the next one. Okay, so, so I want to start you out with a very complicated and delicious narrative that encourages you, first of all, I hope to listen to it, and then second, to suspend judgment, right? So here we go. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is it. On August 21st in 1706, Juan Antonio de Arriola filed suit in Lima's royal court to clarify Maria Albina's legal status. According to Juan Antonio, Maria Albina's godfather, her padrino, had freed her at the baptismal font with her owner's knowledge and consent. Her godfather, Don Antonio, had paid Maria's owner 100 pesos for her purchase price, insisting that he would not go to the baptismal font if she went as a slave. Maria's owner, Don Diego accepted Don Antonio's terms, and Maria was inscribed in the baptismal books of Piura as free. Maria's baptismal manumission occurred when she was a young child. She was not more than 3 years old. But when she turned 5, she became re-enslaved. In 1665, Don Diego gifted, donado, right? He gifted a family of slaves to his goddaughter, Doña María Lara, as she went she entered the Convento de la Santísima Trinidad. Maria was included in the donation along with her parents, Catalina and Antonio, and they were supposed to serve Doña Maria's needs as she entered the convent. Okay, next slide. These are some nice slides. You'll like these. So this is the font. Then we go to the next one. This is just the condition of what I had to deal with, but it's a beautiful story, kind of. I mean, I like the story. You might not like the story, but I like the story. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I spent a lot of time thinking about nuns and religious communities, right? As ways of thinking about female spaces. So about 10% of Lima's population at this time lived in religious enclosure. And next slide. Lucia. There we go. These are impressive spaces, and the more established monasteries and convents were referred to as cities within cities. As you can imagine, these spaces depended a lot on enslaved labor to make all of this religious contemplation possible. Elite women went into the convent with a dowry commensurate with their status, their parental status, and their rank, and also went with a retainer of slaves, dowries, crockery, silverware, poultry, to take up her place as a bride of Christ. So with those contextual points, we're going to return to Maria's case. Maria is technically free, right? Because she was inscribed in the baptismal books as free. She's technically free, but she's also dependent on her parents, given her young age. She's only 5, right? There's some confusion in the record as to whether her parents protested her re-enslavement, or even if they understood the full implications of what was going on. The Carta de Donación made it clear that the family was alone to Doña Maria. Upon her death, or if she left the convent, the family reverted to Don Diego, to his custody. Now, this caveat might have been a way to get around the fact that religious women were not supposed to own property, and that they would have gone into the labor pool of the property and not the labor pool of the convent, and not being able to be exclusively assigned to Doña Maria. Anyway, Maria Albina, remains as serving Doña Maria for over 20 years, right, in the convent. And she served her as what's called a donada, which was her own personal servant. So I'm thinking about this from Catalina. I'm thinking about this from the perspective of parents, right? Catalina and Antonio did not want to leave Maria behind in Piura. Piura is up in the north of Peru, and they're going to, to Lima. So in order for the child to be with the parents, they have to bring her. So according to one witness, Catalina later lamented that her daughter had been part of this beneficent gift, but she consoled herself that Maria would receive a religious and virtuous upbringing in the cloisters, right? Que se educara en recogimiento. Catalina was also persuaded by Doña Maria's virtue and Christian conscience, and she was confident that Doña Maria would respect her daughter's freedom. Securing Maria's education and a brighter future may well have been the reasons that her parents did not leave her behind in Piura. Anyway, we're going to fast forward. In 1683, Juan Antonio and Maria Albina get married. Juan Antonio was a free pardo, a free man of color, who was a mature man in his 30s, who earned good money, pesos de buen caudal, like he had, 2 pennies in his pocket, as my mother would say, during his various trips at sea as a sea captain. Prior to their marriage, Juan Antonio diligently tried to ascertain Maria Albina's status from Don Diego. By that time, the parents have died, right? Catalina and Antonio, and Maria Albina reverted to serving in Don Diego's household. Consequently, all marriage negotiations took place with Don Diego. Juan Antonio offered to pay for Maria's purchase price, right? He offers not just a dowry, like he offers to pay for her purchase price. But Don Diego reassured him that he had freed Maria Albina and that the Carta de Libertad was on file with the notary who drew up the document. However, when Juan Antonio went in search of the notary had fallen into dementia and he didn't remember anything. So Juan Antonio pressed Don Diego for a copy, and the only document that Don Diego could find was the original Carta de Donación of the gift of the family. So when he read the Carta de Donación, Juan Antonio recognized that his wife was freed twice, once at the baptismal font and another time through manumission by grace. So in 1683, when Juan Antonio files the first lawsuit on behalf of his wife for personal services, for 20 years, what he's trying to do is prove that his wife was free when she went into the convent, right? Given the lack of documentation in this case, it's incumbent on Juan Antonio to make the strongest case possible to both clarify Maria's status by claiming the payment for personal services. I don't actually think that he meant to get any money. What he meant to say is that for 20 years she was due a salary because she was a free woman, well, a free child. So he filed a lawsuit for, and it took 2 decades, right? It took 20 years, this lawsuit, where he's trying to clarify her status. And over the course of 23 years, the lawsuits take different paths. But by 1706, when we started the story, the couple had 6 children and 2 grandchildren. Their ages range from 22 years of age to 6 months. So at stake in the lawsuit is the freedom of Juan's entire family, right? Because of the law of the slave womb. And so it's vital that Maria was declared free from the time she was a child. When documents were not available, Juan Antonio and Maria summoned an impressive number of witnesses who all attested that Maria had been freed as a child and that the couple relied on that grant of freedom to conduct their lives as free people, right? So despite the absence of documents in the record, like there's no baptismal record, I don't think he went back to Piura, but or a Carta de Libertad, everybody who is in her social network regarded her as free. So the question is, like, how did she live her life unencumbered by the confusion about whether she's free or enslaved? So as we go through the record with her husband, Juan Antonio, we become acutely aware of this very slippery terrain of quasi-emancipation, or what I'm calling fractional freedom, traversed by so many people who were enslaved, right? Particularly those who are freed as children and then, have murky circumstances as they grow into adulthood. But these are, children a lot of times remain free because their purchase price as children is much more achievable, but they remain close to their parents who are in servitude or often enslaved. So these are very thick relationships. These are not just relationships of labor, but they're also of godparenthood, apprenticeship, right? Especially for boys, money lending, landlord, witness, testator. And, you know, we look at these cartas de libertad as a way to imagine the multifaceted dynamics of lifetime manumission, right? So I'm looking, Maria's case is something at the font, right? It's taking place in a public Catholic ceremony at the font. By the time she gets a carta de libertad, if she ever got one, it's very, very much a process of being bound up with her owner's patronage, right? It's not necessarily a quid pro quo for payment and services rendered. It's really, really legally couched in these terms of effective labor. So baptismal manumission is something different because of the stage of life in which it occurs. But from what I've seen over the years, there is a higher probability of re-enslavement because of where the child is in relation to the parent, right? A child would have to remain within close range of the parish in which she was manumitted, and the baptismal emancipation or the baptismal manumission would have to be very public, right? So if you think about padres no conocidos and, you know, all of these kinds of cover-ups that happen at the font, it's very easy to have these be hidden, right? Historias escondidas. So everybody knows, so the baptismal manumission has to be very public for it to hold legal weight. And in this case, 30 people knew that Maria Albina had gone to the font as free. None of them were there. They just knew that, right? That was the sort of the lore of it. So freedom granted at a young age is also very relatively easy to lose. It's contingent on an owner's beneficence or an emancipator's presence. Papers are also easy to lose. I don't know how many of people in the audience are historians, but we as historians, we cling to paper, and we think that people also cling to papers, especially, in una ciudad letrada, and this is all, this is really what this is supposed to be about. But in Maria Albina's case, no one had been careful enough with her papers. But the absence of documentation in this case is very striking, especially when we think of, how important notarial records are. So then the question becomes, does Maria Albina need the documentation? By 1706, anybody who could have had a claim to her was dead. Doña Maria de Lara, she died childless. She died without children, because, there was one immaculate conception for one Maria, and that was already taken. So she did not have that. So she didn't have any children. And the terms of the Carta de Donación were such that the convent had no property claim on Maria. Don Diego was also dead, and he claimed he freed Maria. So, what it really sort of allowed me to do when I saw this case and spent a lot of time with it was to focus on this question of quasi-emancipation, of fractional freedom, and the performance of freedom, right, in urban slaveholding societies. It also let me see that the fact that they acted like free people, they never paid a jornal to anyone, they were masters of their own time, they lived in the same barrio de la Compañía de Jesús for over 20 years, this sort of indices of behavior that really struck at essences of respectability that made them seem like free people in the eyes of their peers, right? So I'm going to finish, Lucia and Sol, I'm just going to finish with a couple questions here. The first question is that, you know, is this a generalizable case or is it just a deliciously rich case? Like, how much can I draw from this, right? And I think it's a fair criticism to say that we take rich cases and extrapolate from that to draw larger conclusions. And what I've been saying is that it was easy for Maria Albina to be re-enslaved, but it was more difficult for people to claim ownership over her because of her very fortunate circumstances. Can I see the next slide? Okay, so these are also the records that we have to deal with. And I don't know if people, their paleography is that good, but this says lunes 24, 24 de la no sé qué, de 1649 años, yo, el licenciado don Antonio de la Cerda, de La Coruña, expuse y puse óleo y crisma a Lorenzo de edad de 10 meses, a quien en caso de necesidad echó agua un sacerdote, hijo de Nicolasa de los Ríos, cuarterona esclava de doña Ángela de los Ríos, y de padre no conocido. Fueron sus padrinos Sebastián y Catalina Malo, y el dicho día escribió la dicha Ángela de los Ríos un papel en que dice es libre el dicho niño Lorenzo, aunque su madre es esclava. So from that, you know, there's lots there, right? You have what we would call a mixed status family. You have a young child, 10 months, who's free. The person who is freeing is the owner of the mother, right? Who is herself a cuarterona. Can I see the next slide? Okay, this one's a little bit more difficult, but it says at the end, y el dicho Bernardo le dio libertad en la pila, right, in the baptismal font, la dicha Gracia, madre de su madre, y presentaron en presencia de los testigos que lo fueron. But actually what this is saying is that he is also going to be in one of these situations in which the mother is free and the owner is still exercising ownership over the mom, right? So, you know, these are, so can we get one more slide? This is the sort of the situation where I'm trying to argue that this is not just a generalized, you can draw conclusions from these rich cases, right? So the next slide will show you something more. Okay, so this is, you know, just 1 year of baptismal, you know, records. But what you really see is that there's a high percentage of children with unknown fathers, right? 74. And then, you know, that outnumber enslaved children, right? One more, please. Oh no, maybe back to. So what I was calling these mixed status children, there are 110 of them. And slave children with unknown fathers, that's a huge amount, right, of illegitimate children. Much more than slave children of a marriage. And then children freed at the font, 31. So you know, Maria Albina is not someone who, like, I just found, and there are not other people like her, right? They do exist. But, you know, the point is that what you have to show is that other people had the same trajectory after Maria Albina, right? That they were either re-enslaved because of their circumstances, or if this is just unique to her case. Even at this level of magnification, I think that the case offers us very valuable information about slavery. Manumission for me is larger than slavery. You know, I don't believe that manumission, somebody like Orlando Patterson is always saying that manumission does slavery's dirty work. It definitely has its own dynamics and its transactional realities that all people accept. And that's what they live their lives around. It's not a frozen institution. It creates ripples of activity, of movement, and of even opportunity. Right? It allows Maria Albina a life on the margins of bondage, but still outside them. And finally, it brings up very interesting intrafamilial dynamics, right? It illuminates the relationships between freed children and enslaved mothers, like Maria and Catalina, Maria and her own children, and the impact of that mixed status on Juan Antonio and his own family. And it says for me that in order for us to think about slavery or understand slavery, we have to think about what freedom looked like. And we have to understand what fractional freedom looked like and how it was lived. And I want, you know, I'm done now, but I want to, in closing, I want to reiterate that this is the space in which the majority of people in the Iberian world lived, right? In this liminal space, not in total bondage and not in total freedom, but in these very enmeshed relationships, household relationships of contingent liberty. So thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening. I think you can stop sharing now, Zelia. Great. Thank you so much, Lucia, for doing that. I mean, I know it's so difficult to, but we did it. We did it.
Gracias. Gracias, Michelle. Siempre es un placer escucharte. Seguramente del otro lado haya algunas preguntas o comentarios. Tenemos, según lo que nos decían, 30 segundos de demora entre que llega la transmisión de Zoom a YouTube. Y yo cuando te escuchaba atentamente pensaba en algunas cosas que me gustaría comentarte para dialogar sobre tu trabajo, que es muy interesante y que ha abierto muchas puertas a pensar la historia de la esclavitud, la historia del derecho, desde una perspectiva de género y desde una perspectiva que, de cierta manera, le otorga a esas mujeres, a esos que son sujetos, una cierta capacidad de agencia, por decirlo de alguna manera, en marcos que muchas veces son acotados, pero que muchas veces se pensaron de una manera muy rígida, ¿no? Como si esas mujeres no tuviesen esas vetas o esos márgenes de movimiento para manejarse con la justicia. Y creo que tu estudio y lo que vos demostraste en esta exposición, que hay una cierta capacidad o ese margen de maniobra que las habilita a esas resistencias, a esas negociaciones en estas cortes que les permitían nada más ni nada menos que obtener su libertad en muchos casos, estas posibilidades de maniobra, y que eran muy importantes para ellas y para sus vidas, y cómo a través de esa lectura, como decimos en castellano, a contrapelo de las fuentes, que son muy complejas de encontrar esas voces realmente, vos mostrás estas libertades fraccionadas y también identidades superpuestas, ¿no? Y cómo ahí aparece algo que tiene que ver también con una perspectiva de género que es interseccional, ¿no? Que no solamente tiene en cuenta al género, sino también otros elementos estructurales que son elementos estructurales de desigualdad, ¿no? Y cómo eso se vincula con esas libertades fraccionadas. Y lo que pensaba, o mi pregunta, tenía que ver con pensar, como vos traes también el bautismo como un elemento central, ¿no?, en estas maniobras, si la maternidad aparece como peso en estas cortes, porque el hijo de una mujer esclava podía nacer esclavo o esclava, o en estos trámites tenían la posibilidad de dislocarse de ese lugar, ¿no?, de ser libre. Entonces, una de las preguntas tenía que ver con esto, ¿no?, con cómo juega la maternidad en este entramado social, pero también judicial, ¿no? Esa era la pregunta que se me venía a la cabeza, sobre todo porque muchas veces, bueno, vos bien lo decís, ¿no? Hay tramas que son de afecto, de intimidad, ¿no? Y que tienen que ver con tocar ciertas fibras de la justicia que pueden habilitar la obtención de la libertad, ¿no? Entonces, mi pregunta iba por ese lado.
Claro, en realidad bueno, si seguimos la ley de partos, ¿no? Partos secula ventram, que es que el hijo sigue la condición de la madre. Es fuerte, es un incentivo muy fuerte si hay condiciones que facilite la libertad de un bebé o un niño, y que haya un tipo de ceremonia acerca del bautismo, ¿no? Porque esto parece en el templo, con el cura, hay testigos, no solo testigos, pero hay padrinos. Y es una cosa muy curiosa porque aunque hay pago, ¿no? Porque se compra la libertad muchas veces, casi en 90% de los casos. Si hay pago, no se menciona en los libros de bautismo, porque esto es como la manumisión tiene que ver con la bondad del amo, y el amo o la ama quiere, o sea, figurar como buen católico, o lo que sea, que esto está pasando, aunque esté recibiendo dinero. Y esa es una cosa muy interesante, pero es obvio de que sí hay condiciones favorables para esto, para la libertad de un niño, que lo hagan, ¿no? Para terminar el estatus. Tu pregunta en lo que se refiere a la intersectionality es cierto, ¿no? María Albina, por ejemplo, por decir, porque estamos hablando de ella, era una mujer casada, era una mujer, ¿no?, que había tomado Estado en estos términos del siglo XVIII, XVII. Ella había tomado Estado y de todas maneras era una mujer, no de la élite, pero muy acomodada, ¿no? Estable, además tenía muchos hijos, entonces la gente la veía como madre, maternidad. Quien le estaba llevando el caso era su marido, pero no siempre es así, ¿no? Muchas mujeres eran litigantes por su propia, como tú dices, ¿no?, agencias. Yo prefiero, en vez de agencia, siempre digo protagonismo, porque yo creo que el tema de la agencia ha sido, o sea, que casi ya no tiene sentido, pero Es un poco discutido, pero protagonismo para mí me hace sentir o me hace entender más las maniobras de las personas, ¿no? Entonces, hay un cruce o hay, ¿no?, la intersección de generación. O sea, si estamos hablando del ciclo de vida de una niña que nace y sus papás también eran casados, eran, ¿no?, más estables, su estatus dentro del claustro, que también estaba recogida, no estaba trabajando como jornalera en las calles, lavando ropa, cocinando, o sea, ella estaba recogida. Y también la maternidad, ¿no? La maternidad le daba bastante prestigio. En casos que no, las mujeres no tenían esa pinta, ¿no? También hay que ver que ellos, porque aunque no estén en la corte, pero están presentando sus casos, están presentando sus pleitos, se pintan, ¿no? Que ellos son, o sea, ellos van a enfatizar las cosas que más quieren, ¿no? Porque saben que más favorece la libertad. Y en eso, o sea, yo prefiero siempre, porque el tema del sexo entre el amo y la esclava es muy controvertida, pero yo prefiero y siempre he preferido ver las intimidades que no sean sexuales, ¿no? Que no sean sexualizadas. Pero eso sí, o sea, la cifra que presenté, ¿no?, de padres no conocidos, eso sí es fuerte. Entonces, como una mujer con un hijo, bueno, que un hijo natural o algo así, que no tiene el papá así nombrado, ¿cómo puede ella negociar la libertad de su hijo? ¿No? Siendo sin honor, siendo negra, siendo pues desamparada, como puede. Entonces ya, a eso voy con tu pregunta, pero si el incentivo es, ¿no?, asegurar la libertad del bebé o del niño, hay que ver las cartas que tiene para jugar, ¿no?
Gracias, Michelle. Hay en el chat, bueno, agradecen y felicitan por la investigación y por la charla. Y Vicky Peto pregunta por qué algunos niños, niñas fueron liberados y no sus padres.
Es una buena pregunta y hay que tomar tiempo y cuidado con la respuesta. En principio, el costo de la libertad de un niño es mucho más bajo que un adulto. Eso es lo práctico. Entonces, si tú tienes que recaudar 100 pesos del tío o del padre no conocido o sea, esto es mucho más factible que lo hagan. Hay también el tema del afecto y hay también el tema del hogar. Si se acuerdan, yo había hablado del hogar como un espacio de mucha tensión, envidia y todo eso. Para mí, lo que yo veo muy claro es que quieren tener, o sea, los amos quieren tener bajo de control o sea, la mano de obra de sus esclavos. Y esto es una manera casi, porque los están pagando, o sea, no es gratis, ¿no? Les está pagando, pero es una manera de asegurar que los papás se queden, se quedan en el hogar, o la madre, por lo menos. Ella se va a quedar porque quiere quedar con su hijo. Y eso se ve en los monasterios, se ve en los hogares así más prestigiosos y más humildes, ¿no? Es una estrategia de tener la mano de obra asegurada a través de la liberación del niño. Por eso se ve tanto.
Muchísimas gracias, Michelle, por toda la presentación. La verdad que me resultó muy impactante porque no estoy especializada en historia colonial o en esas etapas o en esos siglos. Sin embargo, me iba resonando mucho de lo que vos señalabas como las ausencias que hemos tenido en nuestra formación también, ¿no? Lo que no hemos podido ver, lo que no hemos sabido ver
Claro.
en estas etapas. Y quería consultarte cómo llegaste a estos temas. Esa es la primera pregunta que quería hacer, digo, si podías compartir con nosotras y con quienes estén siguiendo, ¿cómo llegaste a este tema?
En realidad, gracias por la pregunta, porque casi, o sea, siempre a mí me interesa como a la gente qué es lo que les atrae la historia, ¿no? Con los alumnos siempre les pregunto, o sea, porque si vas a dedicar tu tiempo a eso, tiene que tener no solo la disciplina, pero el amor al asunto, ¿no? Eso es lo que, porque si no es una curiosidad así, eso no te va a hacer aguantar. Pero mira, como dijo Sol en la presentación, o sea, cuando me iba presentando, yo antes era abogada de derechos humanos. Yo trabajaba en una ONG en Lima, en Perú, en Brasil, en Colombia, con mujeres indígenas, y también en Estados Unidos yo trabajaba con inmigrantes. O sea, yo sé cómo es poner en un brief, o sea, no sé cómo es, o sea, en algo para presentar al juez, cómo es que tú tienes que poner o sea,
Un escrito aquí, sí.
no solo esto, sí, pero
Sí.
tienes que pintar a tu clienta en la mejor
Claro.
forma posible, ¿no? Pero a la misma vez, lo que yo estaba viendo en el trabajo, por ejemplo, con mujeres batallando la violencia doméstica, ellos sabían manejar todas las leyes, o sea, sabían y no es que ellos confiaban en las leyes, pero acudieron a las cortes, acudieron a los tribunales, al policía, aunque pues no confían en ellos. Y siempre decía, pero ¿por qué, no? ¿Por qué? Y era como decía Sol, ¿no? Es agencia, eso es protagonismo. Estás haciendo algo y aunque no confíes en el juez porque sabe que el juez es corrupto, no confíes en el policía porque el policía le va, ¿no?, tomar el lado del marido, pero siempre lo están haciendo. Y luego esto como que me despertó y me daba cuenta, o me di cuenta, que esa es una larga tradición de las mujeres, de sujetos así, que acuden a las cortes, que presentan sus casos y que denuncian. Y para ellos y para ellas, en muchas veces, esto sí es el resultado que quiere, porque no piensa que va a avanzar. Pero la denuncia, el irse a denunciar, ¿no? Es algo muy fuerte en las comunidades, yo creo, marginales. Y esto sí siempre me ha atraído, ¿no? ¿Cómo es? ¿cómo es?
Y pensaba, Michelle, con esto que vos decías recién, también está vinculado, yo creo que hay como un interés muy genuino que tiene que ver bueno, con los sectores más vulnerables, y pensaba también que vos sos una ahora historiadora y profesora de Derecho norteamericana que estudia América Latina y que tenés esa curiosidad y esas inquietudes y ese interés que a nosotros también nos llama mucho la atención. Y cuando miraba tus fuentes, pensaba en lo difícil que debe haber sido para vos a poder acceder y leer ese tipo de fuentes que ya tienen un español muy complejo para nosotros mismos, y cómo fue ese proceso no solamente bueno, de hacer historia y trabajar con fuentes que no son de tu país, pero que a su vez tienen un lenguaje específico y en un castellano que no es el habitual. Bueno, cómo fue ese proceso de tratamiento de las fuentes, ¿no? Que eso era una pregunta que se me disparaba a partir de tu última intervención.
Pues es el amor de un buen cuento, ¿no? O sea, esto es, o sea, un cuento así como la María Albina es delicioso, te atrae y tú vas, o sea, paleografía se va aprendiendo, yo he tomado cursos, talleres, pero seguramente, o sea, 100%, me llega un folio con una mano notarial que de la cortesana, por ejemplo, y lo devuelvo, porque ya sé que no voy a poder. El siglo XVI, mucho más difícil. Ahora estoy trabajando en la esclavitud en la península, por eso estoy en España. Y, o sea, el siglo XVI te mata.
Esa era mi otra pregunta, ¿en qué estabas trabajando ahora?
Sí, no, estoy trabajando, o sea, el traslado de la esclavitud doméstica y o sea, la servidumbre desde o sea, del sur de España, de la Andalucía, hacia las Américas, ¿no? Pero, o sea, es solamente la pasión, mis hijos dirían la obsesión, para ir al archivo y quedar y ver lo que me está pasando, ¿no? Eso es. Y además yo creo que estamos en una época en la historia también, ¿no? Que hay más gente interesada en el tema, hay muchas más libros ahora de las mujeres esclavizadas o las mujeres libertas que están haciendo, ¿no? Cómo vivían y qué es lo que están haciendo en México, en Chile, mucho en Argentina. O sea, mi amiga la Candiote, o sea, hay gente que están trabajando estos temas y las fuentes sí las hay, ¿no? O sea, hay que ponerlos a la luz.
Sí, totalmente. Claro, vos decías el libro de Magda Candiotti que salió hace poco.
Sí. Y ella trabaja, aunque ella trabaja otro siglo, pero también eso de ¿no? Free Womb Law y todo eso, que las mujeres también estaban manejando esto del tema de partos, ¿no? De cómo puedes asegurar que sus hijos sean libres.
Sí. Bueno, no sé si hay alguna otra pregunta más, creo que por el chat por lo menos no nos ha llegado ninguna
Quería
otra.
consultar si Fractional Freedoms hay posibilidades de que se publique en español. Yo encontré solo las versiones en inglés circulando.
No,
Si tenés algún
está
proyecto,
en,
está en español también,
sí,
dijiste.
sí,
Bien,
sí, sí.
bien,
Cuando pueda la Sol, la puedo enviar, pero yo
buenísimo.
creo que después de Estados Unidos, o sea, España es terrible para el envío de libros, pero llegando yo os envío, ¿ya? A la Sol me dices cómo.
Para tenerlo acá en la biblioteca, pensaba, digo,
Sí,
como para poder
Sí, sí,
sumarlo
sí.
en la
Claro,
biblioteca de
claro.
la facultad.
Sí, no, pues un placer, pero también ellos pueden solicitar porque está en ebooks y todo eso.
bien, gracias. Sí, sería re interesante que esté en la biblioteca de la facultad, porque nosotros tenemos la carrera de historia y vemos
Sí,
historia
los pueden
colonial,
consultar, ¿no?
sí, y que se pueda consultar, sí.
Claro.
Eh, bueno, no sé si hay alguna pregunta más.
Nos está ese comentario.
No, hay tardes en las que
Hay un
está más
poco-
callado y más callada la gente del público. También muchas y muchas personas de las que se inscribieron en el seminario, digamos, en esta serie de charlas, lo ven a contraturno, digo, lo ven en otros horarios. Entonces,
Porque
me
está
escriben
en línea. Sí, claro.
Claro,
queda en
claro.
línea durante unos días, digamos, como conferencia al menos, así que por las dudas. Eso
Ok,
también nos ha pasado que en la que brindó Hernán a comienzos, ahora ya tiene, no sé, una cantidad de visualizaciones enorme que
me imagino.
incluso supera a quienes se ven inscriptos.
Sí.
Sí. Sí, es que es la idea que se pueda difundir más allá de si pueden estar en este horario o no. Así que bueno, si no hay ninguna pregunta o comentario más, Michelle, nos queda agradecerte muchísimo en nombre
Bueno,
de todo el
el
equipo, ha sido un
agradecimiento es
placer.
todo mío, por la paciencia, por la invitación, por no todo el amor que siento a la distancia. Y ojalá que en un día que podemos, podamos vernos así, cara a cara. Yo voy a ir a Lima en junio.
Ah, bueno,
Bueno,
bien,
podemos empezar
podemos
a coordinar
coordinar.
para poder
Sí,
tenerte aquí como se había imaginado la vez anterior.
Sí, no, porque íbamos a hacer unos ciclos o un ciclo de curso, ¿no? Ah, sí,
sí,
no,
sí, que
muy
justo
bien.
fue lo de la pandemia. La
Claro,
idea era que puedas venir y estar en un seminario de posgrado, habíamos pensado.
claro, sí, no, me encantaría.
Bien,
Bien.
genial.
Bueno,
Bueno, Lu, Hernán,
conocer, sí. Ay, no te escuchamos.
No, eso,
Ahí.
refrendar eso, muchas gracias, muy lindo el intercambio y creo que bueno, que es otra intervención ahora con el mundo colonial que enriquece todo lo que estamos trabajando en este ciclo. Son muchos temas que se abren y un intercambio que queda abierto para ver cómo continuamos.
Muy bien, muy bien. Pues
Bueno,
gracias a todos.
muchísimas gracias.
gracias Michelle, gracias Hernán,
Chao,
Lucía.
Sol.
Nos vemos, chao, chao.